In prior segments, we have touched on the impact cryptocurrency is having on impoverished nations. We've also discussed how modern slavery practices affect our supply chain. But how are we defining slavery exactly? Perhaps we are exaggerating the description of certain forms of labor that are better described as just a little unfair. When most people think about slavery, the imagery tends to be that of someone locked up in like a dungeon of sorts and then forced to do hard labor while, say, connected by the feet with chains connected to multiple other slaves. This is the only definition of slavery that certain forces in this world want you to believe is legitimate. Don't get me wrong, that kind of slavery still exists and affects millions of souls today, but forced servitude is an extremely complex problem. So look at this image. Here are some estimates as to where most slaves are located. What we know is that there are at least 40 million slaves, but we also know these statistics do not account for all forms of abuse or forced servitude. It is vital we realize that many people living in these environments are afraid to reveal themselves due to fear of retribution, so these statistics are considered to be very conservative estimates. The true number of tyrannized or abused human beings is clearly much greater. Okay, yes, I know what you're thinking. Seriously, how does this have anything to do with cryptocurrency? How in the world is this really relevant to me? Why do we have to examine all this? Sure, tragedy exists all over the place. We'll never be able to shut it all down. Just because a few people are unfairly treated, that shouldn't mean that it will ultimately make any difference to me. There can't possibly be anything we can do to eradicate all of it. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, I live in a place I don't have to worry about all that. Well, hear me out. I mean, first of all, we aren't talking about just a few people. As stated, the number of individuals unfairly treated by forced means is likely in the many hundreds of millions. Now, when we usually talk about slavery, much of society assumes it to be just a problem of the past, like depictions of slaves of African descent being abused in the United States prior to the Civil War of the mid-1800s, or Moses freeing Hebrew slaves from Egyptian bondage. As that story goes, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million slaves were eventually freed due to the mercies of an almighty God that had grown weary from the cries of his children. In some ways, it sounds more like a bedtime story to us now. These slaves were described as being delivered from bondage, given a new hope of freedom in a new land, and there was a big happy ending. Then the world became a better place. Look, whatever you believe, slavery in our modern day is real, and more widely distributed and in higher numbers than what happened in the past. Actually, slavery has been modernized, and the powerful supply chain established by the Western or industrialized world has largely attempted to obscure what is really taking place. Why? Well, the sad truth of the matter is that those that are born in nations where slavery is uncommon tend to benefit economically and have a better standard of living due to the very efforts of the slave population in the world. You probably didn't want to hear that. Maybe you should just turn this off and not be bothered by this. If so, you're welcome to do so, but the brave among you will continue to listen and consider what is going to eventually happen as a result of this problem. This can't go on forever, and I'm going to explain why. History has taught us over and over the oppressed always rise up, and as of right now, they finally have the means to do it. Let me set one thing perfectly straight, and you might be surprised. This discussion is not intended to somehow try to convince you to personally rise up against the abusive practices of slavery in some way. This is not a bleeding heart discussion as to how you personally can stop the exploitation out there. Frankly, I don't even believe that attempts to do so would help much. What you will learn by continuing to listen to all this is that the slaves have already found a way to escape it all. So good news, you're off the hook. You don't have to do anything. But as I said, if the supply chain that has been carefully laid out in the manner it has suddenly loses this extraordinary, inexpensive labor force, you better believe it will affect you somehow, no matter who you are or where you live. And the manner in which the oppressed will rise up could end up putting you at an enormous disadvantage if you do not pay attention to some of the subtle changes happening all around us. These changes are about to revolutionize society everywhere. We will get to that, but first, did you know that around 2/3 of all cocoa produced worldwide is provided by slave labor? So basically, chocolate comes from slaves, for the most part. It's true, look it up if you want. If you have been a consumer of chocolate at any point in your life, it is highly likely you have partaken in a product of slavery. And not only is most cocoa produced by slaves, but a large proportion of those slaves are children. Manufacturers in the United States, for example, don't really tend to talk about where they like to procure the raw ingredients that are used to produce chocolate. The providers of this dark, raw product are faceless and obscured by legitimate businesses that appear to operate as respectable sources for the manufacturing industry. But behind those seemingly respectable businesses, carefully obscured, there are sinister labor practices that are entrenched and have proven very difficult to change through diplomatic or even legal means. So what is to be done about this? Should we consider it to be our responsibility to follow the supply chain of every product that we consume? Is it immoral to eat chocolate? Some of you are no doubt still asking yourselves, how are we defining slavery here anyway? I admit, that's not been established very well thus far. Perhaps what the International Labor Organization, or ILO, calls slavery really isn't all that bad. Is a slave simply someone that lives in chains and is forced to do labor for free and is just fed merely enough to sustain life in order to do so? And what if there is financial compensation involved? If someone is paid even a few cents a day, does that mean by definition that they are not a slave because there is at least some form of payment rendered? It's interesting to note that the slaves in the southern United States prior to the Civil War in the mid-1800s were actually quite commonly given money for their labor despite being considered slaves. And contrary to popular depiction, slaves in the South were generally treated fairly well and usually enfranchised more like dependent family members to the people they served. It was uncommon for them to be tortured as is often depicted, although terrible abuses certainly occurred on occasion, as we all know. Furthermore, is a slave someone that has no rights whatsoever? In our modern world, children usually have very few rights as citizens anywhere and could actually meet most definitions we could ascribe to slaves. So are we treating children properly when they seem to have very few rights, get no pay for household work, and have no legal ability to leave their homes without law enforcement returning them to their parents when they run away? It ultimately begs the question, are all forms of forced servitude bad? These are very intelligent and provocative questions, and I congratulate you if you've been asking yourself these things already. It seems that we must look at the idea of slavery as perhaps more of a spectrum than any one particular definition. There is forced servitude that can be reasonable and legal. For example, sometimes a court of law can impose labor as a form of punishment, so we know that type of thing is generally considered acceptable. On the other hand, at what point is, say, a legally designated minimum wage considered to be so low that it starts to resemble compensation only a slave could accept? And what specifically constitutes forced labor? Slaves of the old American South were not generally in chains. They could run away quite easily for the most part. Most actually didn't want to. Yes, at the time there were consequences for them that were scary if they ran off, but isn't that the case with many things we're obligated to do even today? Like, say, for example, if someone decides it is not right that they are taxed to a certain degree, and that they personally feel it is unfair or excessive. What if they try to evade or run away from what they feel is an abusive tax policy? Should that policy be considered some form of slavery? Arguably, it is at least involuntary servitude, which, interestingly, is specifically mentioned in the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution as something that is prohibited. One almost has to ask the question, is any situation where one individual takes advantage of another person bad? Let's say someone leverages a power, talent, or skill over someone less capable, such that a seemingly unfair outcome occurs to the disadvantaged individual. For example, one of the latest criticisms we hear is that Caucasians have this thing called white privilege, which imparts an unfair advantage to that segment of the population. Are these so-called forms of advantage somehow creating an environment of what you might call forced servitude on this slavery spectrum we're attempting to define? If so, where on that spectrum should we place Caucasians and their perceived advantages over others? And if things like white privilege should be construed as harmful or damaging, what about tall person privilege, attractive person privilege, young person privilege, experience privilege, health privilege, smelling good privilege, stable or rich family privilege, or last but not least, intelligence privilege, which incidentally is statistically the greatest predictor of worldly success we know of? Where do all these appear on the spectrum of humans unfairly taking advantage of other humans? Frankly, it seems silly that some of these attributes might be considered harmful because in all cultures, those individuals that possess natural gifts of strength or virtue are considered exceptional or even heroic when they utilize their natural gifts in competition with others. It is lauded much of the time, and we even tend to reward the most beautiful and intelligent among us for conquering the world with their amazingness. Ultimately, what we need to all come to some level of agreement on is that to some degree, the world is just inherently unfair due to random and varied natural circumstances. And much of it is nobody's fault in particular. So ultimately, you need to realize that we are not attempting to blame any particular race or group for all these injustices per se. This conversation is not meant to be some sort of beatdown of those that are faring particularly well in the world. What we are attempting to do here is show how all of us, by collectively participating in superior transactional technology available to us today, will dramatically contribute to the improvement of these sad conditions many poor souls face throughout the world, whether we realize it or not. Now, there are egregious forms of abuse as demonstrated, but on the other end of the spectrum, there are examples of exceptionalism that triumph over mediocrity in a way that is commendable, but yet demonstrates a clear advantage of one person or group over another. What seems to follow as a natural conclusion once we consider all of these questions is that this is a complex issue, and there don't seem to be any obvious or at least immediate solutions that can fix everything. Doesn't it seem that we should probably at least try to make the playing field as fair and equal as possible, first and foremost? It stands to reason that if there are any circumstances where dishonesty and theft are occurring, these violations clearly should be eradicated to the best of our ability, right? At least. I mean, life will never be entirely fair, but surely we should try to make things as fair as we can while harming as few people as possible. But where do we draw the lines between slavery and freedom? When is someone truly being abused? And at what point would that person consider themselves to be freed from the terrible bondage they have been suffering? This issue is extremely complex and subjective, and like many things, the devil is in the details. You are going to start to see that the only way we can do anything about all this is to somehow provide a way for people everywhere to at least be allowed to participate in the world economy directly. I am going to attempt to paint a picture for you in the next segment as to how and why cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are going to level the playing field for everyone. We have been talking about Satoshi Nakamoto, the inventor of Bitcoin. In case you didn't know this, he was the first person to mine Bitcoin, and most people believe he is sitting on a huge amount of Bitcoin mined long ago. That doesn't sound very fair, does it? Here we're talking about leveling the playing field, and the very inventor of Bitcoin has a huge advantage by owning a large percentage of all Bitcoin. So I really need to tell you something important about him. First of all, Satoshi Nakamoto does not consider himself to be an entrepreneur, and he has not been cashing out any of his early Bitcoin that he mined on the network. Those tokens are worth billions on the current market, and yet they remain untouched. He is the only person that could possibly hold private keys for hundreds of thousands of early Bitcoin. There are very good reasons as to why he has not been touching those Bitcoin mined as long ago as 2009. They are going to continue to remain untouched, never to be disturbed. And soon, I'm going to tell you why.